Continuing on with the five good emperors, here is the last of the five good emperors, or the fifth good emperor, Marcus Aurelius. And so, of course, he was chosen because he married Antoninus Pius's daughter, okay, and he had already kind of proven himself as a capable leader and faithful leader and good leader. And so Antoninus Pius decided, yes, I'll adopt him and make him my heir. And so Marcus Aurelius takes over in 161 at about 40 years old, okay, and he will rule from 161 to 80 CE. Of course, he lived from 121 to 180. Okay, and he right away when he becomes emperor, there are multiple rebellions. First in Egypt, Spain, and Britain. Okay, as well as elsewhere. We'll talk about in a minute. And so he kind of travels around a little bit to some of those places, but he also sends his own military commanders and stuff to deal with it a lot. He doesn't go to all of them, I don't believe. He did travel to some, and he puts down these rebellions. He then has to deal with multiple rebellions and invasions from multiple different groups along the Dacia area, along the Danube River, as well as just the entire Danube River area, which is basically this entire area right here. Okay, large portion of area. Constantly barbarians, the uncivilized people, as they would call them, coming across the Roman border of the Danube River and invading Rome, and so, or the empire anyway. And so Marcus Aurelius went out to the Danube area and starts fighting these series of wars called the Danube Wars over several years against the barbarians. Eventually, he realizes and comes to the realization that this war is just going to continue for decades upon decades, if not forever, along this area. That some of these barbarians are just going to keep on coming across. And so he decides that he needs to do something about these people, and decides that instead he's going to make an alliance with them. So he actually sits down and actually starts speaking to some of the leaders, and making extensions to start talking with the leaders, and then eventually does. And eventually it is decided that the friendly groups of these Germanic tribes and Danube tribes, Danube region tribes, are going to become something called federati, or foederati. Okay? And the foederati is the Latin word for federates, okay? Kind of like friends, but not quite. Kind of more like allies. And so what Marcus Aurelius comes to the deal with these foederati tribes, or these groups of leaders that are going to become the foederati, is that the foederati are going to be given Roman land along the borders, okay, on kind of both sides of the Danube River, some on the other side and some on the Danube, on the Roman side, okay, and that they're going to live along this border, and that as long as they continue to be friendly to Rome, they get to stay there in peace. Okay, that these people, the Federati, don't have to leave and aren't going to be attacked by the Romans. But they also have to do one other thing other than just be friendly to the Romans, and that is to help defend the border of Rome against any other tribes that might attack. Okay? And this may seem like it's a big ask for them, but it really isn't, because what they're getting out of it is somewhere peaceful to live, okay? And if they get invaded by other tribes, or attacked by other tribes, or Rome is going to get attacked by other tribes, these people are living along that edge, and where they're going to be attacked at by these other tribes. So they would be fighting other tribes that would be also attacking them themselves. So they'd be kind of defending their own homeland at this point. And so that's how the Federati is set up along the border here. And this is kind of go on for years. After Marcus Aurelius, this deal is going to continue. Eventually, there's going to be some happenings up in that area of the Federati, which we'll talk about in the next couple lectures, which is going to be important because of that. But we'll come back to that when it is time for that. In 177, while still campaigning on the Danube River, okay, he actually decides that he's campaigning along with his son, Commodus, okay, his son Commodus, his actual genetic son, okay, and Commodus at this point is showing that he's a pretty good military leader and fighter and stuff, but that's all he's really showing to his father. But Marcus Aurelius kind of has a soft spot for his son, Okay? And so he decides that he is actually going to make Commodus his joint emperor, so that they're going to co-rule together. And for the next 3 years they do that, until in 180 CE, Marcus Aurelius dies of natural causes. Okay? And so, obviously, Commodus is going to take over. And so that is why Marcus Aurelius is going to be the last of the 5 good emperors, because he picks his own son, and his son isn't very good, okay? And we'll talk about that in the next slide, okay? But let's lastly talk about one last thing about Marcus Aurelius. He is also known, in addition to being the last of the 5 good emperors, or the 5th good emperor, he is also known as the philosopher emperor, or Stoic emperor, okay? Because he believed in the Greek philosophy of Stoicism, okay? And don't worry about that, that's a philosophy class discussion rather than this course. But Marcus Aurelius actually wrote a book called Meditations, using the ideas of the Greek Stoic philosopher that had come beforehand, Epictetus, or Epictetus. And Epictetus was a Greek philosopher from, obviously, Greece, and had written many different things about the Stoic ideas of Stoicism, and the philosophy of Stoicism. And Marcus Aurelius had grown up kind of reading those philosophical ideas, and so he decided to write his own book while kind of on campaign and doing other things throughout all of his life. And so he is also known as the philosopher emperor or Stoic emperor. Moving on, let's talk quickly about Commodus. Commodus obviously is the emperor in the movie Gladiator, played by Joaquin Phoenix right here. But obviously this is a statue of what he actually looked like. Not exactly very close, right? He actually had a beard, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He would like to wear around lion furs or tiger furs. He carried a club at times with him because he would actually fight in the gladiatorial combat himself. That is one of the few things the movie actually got right about him, was that he did like to fight and was quite good at it. But he did not kill his father, Marcus Aurelius, like is shown in the movie. If you've seen it. If you haven't, that's okay. You might enjoy it. And anyway, so let's go ahead and talk about Commodus. He lived from 161 to 192, and he ruled as emperor, kind of co-emperor from 177 to 180 with his father, but in 180 he was sole emperor. So 180 to 192. He was Marcus Aurelius' son. When he was chosen to lead and took over as emperor, it had ended about 80 years, really 84 years, worth of emperors being chosen for their merit. Okay, starting all the way back with the beginning of this lecture, Nerva, okay, in the year 96 CE. And so 80 or so years, or 84 years or so, of emperors being chosen because of their merit, not because of relationship, not being the son or direct son or related to the emperor. And even when Trajan and Hadrian Trajan chose Hadrian because he was his cousin, that was not because he was his cousin. He chose him because he was his cousin a little bit, but he also, because he knew who he was and knew Hadrian was capable of ruling. Okay? And so this is very different in this case. And Commodus is not cut out to be a good emperor, and he is definitely not. He is more of an athlete than a leader. He does not really care about leading the empire. He cares about being in charge because he's happy to be in charge and he doesn't want to take orders from anybody, but and he likes making decisions for himself, but he is not being the ruler and leader of the people. He loves to participate in the gladiatorial combats and did fight against animals as well as people. Sometimes the animals were actually injured beforehand, so he could actually definitely defeat them. I think there's a story about him fighting a bear that had already been kind of stabbed. Or at least had been kind of sickly and kept sickly for a few days before actually having to fight him. So, or about a week or so. But he did fight in the gladiatorial arena and the Colosseum himself. He, however, loved chariot racing, but he never actually raced on chariots himself because that was dangerous. That was extremely dangerous to get in chariot races. Big, giant chariot wrecks and stuff, being dragged behind the horses or stomped on or run over by another chariot. Absolutely horrible things happen during chariot races. So he loved to watch them and loved to sponsor them and have them actually happen, but he did not participate in them himself. He believed himself to be Hercules, and that's kind of why he dressed up like this and wore his beard and grew a beard and stuff, like the Greek half-god Hercules from mythology, and had a club because Hercules had a club, and used a club rather than a sword at times. And so he kind of believed himself to be like this reincarnation of Hercules, basically. He was very cruel. He fought and killed gladiators. He fought and slaughtered animals. That really goes up there. But he was also cruel to people that disagreed with him, politicians, etc. There were multiple conspiracies against him. Most of them failed. We'll talk about the one that ends up not failing in a minute. But he definitely wasn't very good as a ruler for the Empire of Rome. The movie Gladiator also gets one thing wrong. It makes it look like he's emperor for a very short period of time, but he was emperor for 12 years. Okay? 12 years as emperor. And so the movie got it wrong there. But what we can say is the multiple conspiracies against him to kill him didn't work, for the most part. Until one finally did. And the one that did was supposedly where he was actually wrestling with his standard sparring partner, and that one of them ended up deciding to actually, the gladiator, or the soldier that he was always fighting with, his sparring partner, wrestling partner, basically got him into a chokehold and never let up, is what one of the stories is how he died. Other stories are that he was killed by stabbing and stuff in his room. But he definitely didn't die in the Colosseum like the movie Gladiator shows. That didn't happen. The Praetorians possibly also were responsible for kind of hiring that person to kill him, or they were the ones that actually stabbed him in his room, depending on the way you want to tell the story, whether it was his sparring partner, which was probably a Praetorian Guard member. They decide, once he's dead, that they're not going to just, nominate one of themselves as the ruler. They're actually going to sell the emperorship. They're going to actually sell it to the highest bidder. They're going to start asking people who wants to be emperor in the empire. And they spread out letters to, the richest people and commanders and stuff throughout the empire and senator members. And the highest bidder gets to be emperor, and we'll talk about who that is in a minute. But what you need to know is this is the end of the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana that started under Augustus, that there was peace during this period of time, up until this, relatively. Yeah, there was some rebellions and fights, and battles, but for the most part, it was relatively peaceful. Like, Rome was never under, this massive worry that a major civil war was going to break out, or a major invasion of them was going to happen. There was the Danube Wars and rebellions elsewhere, and the Celts and stuff in Britain, but it wasn't something that was threatening the entire empire. After this, after Commodus's death, that's going to happen, okay? And so let's go ahead and start talking about what ends up happening. So, eventually, Septimus Severus takes over a year after Commodus's death, okay? Because Commodus dies in 192, and it takes about a year for Septimus Severus, this man right here, who lived from 145 to 211 and became emperor in 193 and ruled until 211, to take over. Septimus Severus was a member of the Severan family, and he was supposedly the seventh son of his father. Whether that was true or not, that's how he got his name Septimus, which means seven. But Severus was his family name, okay, his last name, and he begins the Severan dynasty. And it starts in 193, and there's going to be multiple Severans until the year 235, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So it's a long dynasty, multiple Severans after him. He was actually from Africa, okay, from North Africa. He was actually possibly Punic, okay, possibly Phoenician in descent, originally from the area of Carthage. We are not sure if he may have been dark-skinned or not. A lot of people say that he was, but there's no real proof that he was or not from what I have read. But that doesn't mean he wasn't. Okay, we just know that he was North African, but Romans had been living there as well, and Italian Romans, so maybe he was actually Italian by descendancy, maybe it was mixed genetics, maybe he was purely African. We don't know, okay? Or Arabic somewhat. But we don't know exactly. So what we do know is he was from North Africa. That's what we know, okay? He was married to a Syrian woman from Syria, obviously, Julia Domna, and she was extremely well educated. She is actually one of the most educated women ever in the Roman Empire, okay? Julia Domna. And in fact, when Septimus Severus goes away on campaign because he constantly travels the empire fighting against and putting down some rebellions and also fighting against enemies on the borders and stuff and making sure the borders are safe. He is constantly doing that, and while he is doing that, he comes back to Rome constantly as well. But while he's doing that, she is making sure that things in Rome are going smoothly and sending him letters and basically ruling for him. Which is kind of interesting. She's not exactly empress, but she's basically ruling as, queen or empress, for him. He also recodifies some of the laws, and something called the Golden Laws, where they are actually rewritten down. They're just called the Golden Laws. Don't worry about why. But he recodifies and rewrites a bunch of Roman law, and makes things a little bit less muddled. He increases the size of the military by creating multiple more legions, and he also creates a position of military governors across the empire, which they had already been, but he makes sure that military soldiers are put in positions of the governors, so that if there's a rebellion, that governor knows how to put it down right away because of military experience, rather than having to call for an army to get there, which might take time. He rebuilt parts of the Antonine Wall. Remember how the Antonine Wall was that just big turf grass wall up in England or in Britain? He ends up rebuilding that. That's when they end up pushing out of Hadrian's Wall. By this point, they had kind of crumbled and run back to Hadrian's Wall. And he's like, no, you need to push back. Push against the Celts. So they fight against the Celts then. He has 2 sons along with his wife, Julia Domna. Those sons are Geta and Caracalla. Geta and Caracalla were supposed to take over both of them together after he died. Of course, that lasts all of probably 2 minutes. Well, that's a figure of speech, but very short amount of time because Caracalla almost immediately kills Geta and decides to rule himself. And so Geta is assassinated by Caracalla. Caracalla is then just sole emperor afterwards. Caracalla eventually has children himself, and it continues the dynasty, and family members of the Severus family or Severan family keep on going for quite a while until the year 235 CE. Okay, so about 24 years after Severan died, or Septimus died, is when the reign ends. And Alexander Severus, Alexander Severus is the last Severan, and he is actually killed in Germany, he is assassinated in Germany, and we end up having a couple other people decide to declare themselves emperor. So let's talk about this, and this is the Barracks Emperors, When the last Severan, Alexander Severus, is killed, in 235 CE, we end up having this crisis where who's going to rule the empire? Who's going to take over because the last Severan who doesn't have children is dead? Who takes over? Also, people in the empire start realizing the empire is just too dang big at this time. It's just too big. It's too hard for one person to control all of it. The person, if they're the emperor, is constantly traveling throughout the whole empire to make sure things are okay and to show that, yes, he's emperor at this time. Severus was constantly doing it. Thankfully, he had a good wife to, keep things in control. Previous ones, under the 5 good emperors, started having this problem, like the restless emperor, etc. And so they were constantly traveling, trying to make things work, and people in Rome itself, like the Senate and stuff, were getting upset at times. So who's going to take over? Well, eventually, during this crisis of who takes over, one of the army legions out in the middle of nowhere, don't worry about where, just out in the middle of the provinces somewhere, decides that they're going to nominate their leader, their legion commander, as the next emperor. And so one of the legion commanders is going to be the new emperor. And then that person gets into a fight with another one that is now also doing the same thing with his army. he's declaring himself emperor, and his troops are like, yes, we love that guy. And so that kind of loyalty to the emperors, the army commanders, is beginning to really hurt now against Rome. And so you constantly have these barracks emperors, as they are called, because they are born in the barracks. Not literally born, okay? No, they're not born in barracks, okay? They would be born elsewhere in their homes, but they would grow up constantly with the military and be these warriors and fighters in the military. And they would be in the barracks with their troops when all of a sudden they themselves decide, I want to be the army leader, or their army goes, why shouldn't you be army leader? Or not army leader, emperor. And so that's what would happen. These barracks emperors were basically starting their emperorships in the barracks or military bases throughout the empire. And most of them do not rule from Rome. They take over as emperor. They maybe fight and defeat their enemy, whoever was previous. And we end up having a part where you've got emperor after emperor just claiming as leader, and then they have to fight each other. They're busy fighting against their rivals. Many of them go to Rome itself very quickly, tell the Senate, hey, I'm the new emperor, and rule for a couple weeks there, and then move on elsewhere to go fight against another rival that's about to declare themselves emperor, and usually get their butt kicked and lose, and so another guy comes in. And so many emperors, in just the year 238, 3 years after Alexander Severus died, 3 years later, we have coins showing 8 different emperors in just that 1 year alone. 8 in that 1 year. Between the year 260 to 284, okay, so about 30 years later, we have about 20 claiming to be emperor during that period of time. So some of them actually lasted a year or so. Some of them a little bit more, some of them a little less. Essentially, from 235 to the year 284, okay, is when these barracks emperors happens. The year 235 to 284. So about 50 years almost. We have 3 generations worth. 3 generations of people growing up and living and being able to have children and all themselves. And then the next generation does it. Then the next generation does it. All they know is civil war. That's it. That's all these people know for generations. And so here's a map of a bunch of the Roman emperors that ended up dying in different various ways. And you can close in on it or pause it right here on the video. We'll talk about a quick few. Like Philip the Arab was one here in 249. He dies after losing a battle with Decius. Okay. We've got Gallienus right here. He dies most likely killed by his own troops. He must have been really hated eventually by his own troops, because they would have been the ones that promoted him or backed him originally, and then they kind of kill him. Pupienus and Balbinus, both murdered by their own troops. Hostilian dies of a plague. Gordian number 2, which means there was another Gordian elsewhere that had been named emperor, a guy named Gordian. Gordian number 2 is killed in battle by his father, Gordian, and his father, Gordian the First, commits suicide. Yeah, so Gordian 1 and Gordian 2 roughly die at the same place in Carthage in 238, probably right after each other. Marcus Claudius Tacitus dies unknown causes. We just don't have the records of it. Decius dies against a German warlord on the Danube River. Claudius Gothicus dies of plague. We're not exactly sure. Maximinus Thrax, murdered by his own troops. Carinus dies against Diocletian. And that's where we're going to end right here, is Carinus dies after battle in the year 285 against his rival Diocletian, because a man named Diocletian is going to take over. And so we're going to talk about Diocletian in the next video. And we're also going to talk about the crisis of the 3rd century, which lasts from the year 200, so during the Barracks Emperors, all the way to the year 300, okay? The 3rd century is the year 200 to 300, okay? And it has a ton of political instability, obviously, from the Barracks Emperors. No expansion of the empire because it's too busy with this 3-generation-long, 50-year-long civil war, right? There's less cultivation, a mini ice age, and tax collection issues. And so we're going to talk all about that in the next lecture video, okay? For the final video of lecture 20.